Day 19. Balar, Sirith, and I were in good spirits when we awoke. The day was bright and clear, the buildings charming, and the inhabitants welcoming. These townspeople lived in the last bastion that civilization had progressed to in the west, and while there were plenty of small tribes and settlements further on, the culture and influence of the kingdoms became less apparent as people made their own way in untamed lands. The ecosystem on this side of the mountain range was also quite different. In contrast, this was a land covered by large swaths of conifer forests, forming thick walls of green that couldn't be seen through, darkness always lingering beneath their branches. Before we left, a rough map of the surrounding area was purchased from an ancient-looking man who was tending to a few dairy animals, apparently also partaking in jaunts as an amateur cartographer in his free time. Balar assured us that he knew the territory. I still studied the map as we left town. After a while, I stashed it with a few other scraps and writing materials I kept in my pack, and turned my attention towards getting to know my fellow hunters, who I'd be walking with for quite some time. Balar was a descendant of Tidor, one of the founders of Adura, a few generations removed. Over time, their family tree had been further distancing from life in the mountain, much preferring the open air, sharing the land with animals and wandering peoples. He had grown up with a similar sentiment, choosing to spend much time abroad, though family and certain responsibilities kept him living in the city. He said that he always felt much more alive amongst the trees, that it was where he felt most inspired, and where the best ideas came from. I could sense the weight he carried, choosing the sacrifice of living in Adura over giving into the desire of being alone as a wanderer. There was a quiet dignity to it, and he seemed to have found a balance that brought peace, walking with a strong, measured stride, articulate and wise. Sirith, on the other hand, was almost as polar as you could find. Boisterous, speaking much without not being said. She was an opinionated person, as only those of youth are capable of. It added an energy to the dynamic of the small group, and banter abounded. We picked a route that led along a large stream and continued yet further west. Ultimately, we were after a raptor, a vicious predator that hunted near these parts. The land teemed with life. The predators were always on the hunt. Humans then culled the predators, thus harmony was maintained. From what Balar explained, raptors were tricky, stalking their prey alone or in pairs. Ruthless creatures that ran swiftly on two legs, claws sharp enough to cut a person in two. To take one down was a task that required precision, teamwork, and a plenty of courage, the latter being the most important. Hunters were adequately awarded for such a feat, as various parts of the animal could be sold. There was a cultural admiration of such items, being worn proudly and incorporated into clothing. Money was rarely the primary motivator for one to hunt, though. Most sought it out as a rite of passage, or to protect their lands and loved ones, the exceptions being the more reckless sort who made it their craft. All the while we walked and conversed, the forest grew more wild and more dense. Our route was fortuitous, being next to the stream, as we were able to avoid some of the thickets and shrubs that grew abundantly among the trunks. The land around was ablaze with animal activity, big and small, compounding with the sound of the creek, leaving no option for silence as cries rang out from all directions. This certainly would be a prime place to hunt a raptor. Plenty of food, they were sure to be around. I was alert. Thankfully, the visibility was fairly good, and both Balar and Sirith seemed unconcerned, which calmed me. In the evening we made camp in an open clearing, built a large fire to keep back the night, and slept. Day 20. Morning brought much of what it had the previous day. Clear air and the pleasant sound of nature around us. That was at least until later, when the previously translucent sky was replaced by menacing opaque clouds, darkening the land, marching from over the mountains behind. The air became dry and full of static, and there was a persistent stiff breeze at our backs, prompting me to wrap my cloak tighter. Within hours, the sky was covered by black, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Throughout the rest of the day, the onslaught of the storm only worsened. The light became increasingly dim, while the wind howled through the branches above, sending dirt and pieces of trees whipping through the air. I put my head down and continued to trudge along, following my two companions who were not faring any better. Asirth complained of a tree needle in her eye, rubbing it profusely. One thing I had to appreciate, though, was as the shadows lengthened, it seemed as if the forest took on a whole new shape, donning a new persona as the visibility shrank with the light. Periodically, flashes of lightning would briefly illuminate it all again as it forked along the sky. With the absence of noticeable thunder, it made for an eerie spectacle. Balar had hoped to make more progress in the day to stay on track, but it was becoming increasingly clear that less and less progress was being made now that the ground was becoming slick with mud. From under our hoods, we kept our attention out for a place to get some shelter, hoping to get some respite from the torrent at our backs. Unfortunately, it was some time before we found a suitable clearing that was sheltered somewhat from the storm. The area we found ourselves in was quite strange. There were mounds of dirt and shallow trenches adjacent to each that snaked through the grass, forming connected lines and angles. There was something unnatural about the precision and placement of these embankments. I stumbled over unsteady earth, looking for any sign of a structure or other human involvement, but found none. I had just made it to the top of a small hill, providing slightly more vantage, when I tripped, tumbled down the side into a waterlogged pit. Stunned, I cried out. My companions hastened to me, carefully picking their way to where I was, offering their arm to help drag me from my viscous prison. Feeling around towards their hands and seeing only faint silhouettes, my arm brushed against something hard on the bank. The protrusion made for a steady handhold as I hoisted myself by it, grasping onto an extended hand. Being dragged upwards, I felt my body bumping into more of the objects, almost as if rocks or sticks were poking out from the side. Now drenched, but now back on level ground, we decided that this place would have to be our camp, it being unwise to continue on with so little light. No sooner had we decided than the wind began ripping through the trees in earnest. The sound of a large tree being felled and crashed to the ground somewhere in the distance confirmed our choice. We proceeded with great difficulty to set up camp, using a side of the embankment for some shelter, though still struggling to put up even the most primitive of accommodations, such as fire or a tarp over our heads. Normally, I was one to enjoy storms and extreme weather, but this was even getting to my nerves. When the lightning flashed, I could swear I saw figures among the trees and faces in the sky. The others saw them too. We were finally able to have a quick portion of food, hunkering down right after, completely giving up on the notion of being remotely dry or comfortable. The best one could hope for was not ending up totally waterlogged in a puddle by morning. Rest came in segments during the night, waking often in fits of unease. During one of these bouts, a pale red glow was over the area, sparks floating through the air, not quenched by the rain. I was in too much of a daze from just waking up to make out what the cause was, only feeling a strong sense of dread in the pit of my stomach that made me want to simply shut my eyes, making the world go away. And that is what I did. Day 21. Thankfully, in contrast with the gale of yesterday, the fresh day brought new weather, glorious sunshine with only a remnant of clouds in the sky. The air was vibrant and alive as the last of the precipitation was rolling off the leaves, pooling in sunken areas. Surveying the place we had stayed in the light, it now took on new meaning. It was indeed a man-made space. Great furrows of soil, side by side with earthworks, made from the displaced dirt, formed very precise and purposeful patterns. Climbing up to the low branch of a tree, I could see it in its entirety, winding together upon itself, spiraling from a central stone formation. I shuddered, for it was a design I knew, a symbol of the evil that dwelt on the other side of reality. A rare sight now that the armies of Shadow had been defeated. Only their relics from the past remained, and these were destroyed upon discovery. In the center of it all was a stone plinth. I shuddered to think what took place there. Climbing down from the tree, I noticed scorch mark along the bases of the trees. My companions saw the same among the others surrounding the site, only scorched on the inward-facing sides. It was quite puzzling. We went to the center and broke down the altar with large chunks of rock lying nearby, then smashed the various small stone icons that were present. Whatever this place was used for, the feeling of darkness lingered, the kind you could feel pricking your back. On our way out, I happened to look down into the pit I assumed I had fallen into the previous night. Recoiling with revulsion, I saw bones protruding from the mud. Many bones, more than from one creature. In horror, my mind turned, envisioning the slaughter that must have taken place here. My stomach felt sick as I weakly pointed out my unsettling discovery. Bilar's face became one of disgust and fury, Sirith's one of shock. We had done all we could to dismantle the physical function of the site, but it clearly went deeper. There was an immaterial essence, and that was not as easily purged, lingering and intangible. We turned our attention and energy towards the Creator, in hopes that the place would be cleansed and could eventually find peace. Forlorn, we moved on, discussing amongst ourselves who could be brought to do such things. The tales were, and these were only hinted at, were that people seeking power over others would go in search of helpers, even greater than the seraphs, who would help mortals that sought them with gifts, offering knowledge and skill far beyond what any human possessed, things that elevated them over their fellow man. These beings would prey on the most fundamental of people's desire, curiosity, sufficiency, the ego, and striving for more, things that are inherent to some degree in all of us. When that innate desire is met with things that are deceptive, instead of things that truly sustain and uplift a person, the effects could be disastrous. But not all think this way, and there will be those to whom what has been given is not enough, and to those, the things that plague our world will enable them, bringing about their own demise. We mulled over these solemn topics as we made our way through the twilight forest, only stopping to eat. When night came, we packed away our gear that was now slightly musty smelling from the rain, not having a chance to dry properly. Then, finding a cozy embankment with enough dry wood around to start a fire, we switched to more joyful topics, listening as Bilar told thrilling hunting stories from his younger days, until at last, we drifted off.